A topic of controversy still rages across the world today, forcing millions to question their own beliefs. How can something so small impact the basis of religion itself? Does religion support the claims? What will the blood test results prove? What will be discovered along the way?
The Shroud of Turin is so named because it is proposed to be the burial cloth, or shroud, that wrapped the body of Jesus, following crucifixion. And since 1578, the cloth has resided in the town of Turin in Italy.
The Shroud of Turin conforms to what is known about 1st century Jewish burial practices of using a single linen shroud. Strips of linen were only used to tie the hands and feet. Textile analysis indicates an ancient origin. Threads were hand-spun. The cloth is pieced together in narrow bands with each hank of yarn individually bleached. All indicate an origin earlier than the Middle Ages. If the shroud wrapped a human corpse, as several medical forensic specialists believe, and if it originated in Israel, as many botanists believe, can it ever be proven to be Jesus? Even today, the shroud holds evidence that continues to prove its authenticity. One account of this is the visible damage and repair done back in 1532 of a recorded fire where the shroud was being held. On December 4th in 1532, fire breaks out in the Sainte-Chapelle, seriously damaging all of its furnishings and fittings. Because the shroud is protected by 4 locks, Canon Lambert and 2 Franciscans summon the help of a blacksmith to prise open the grille. By the time they succeed, Marguerite of Austria's shroud casket, as made to her orders by Lieven van Latham, has become melted beyond compare by the heat. But the shroud preserved bar, being scorched and holed by a drop of molten silver, fell on the one corner. Later in April, Chambéry's nuns repair the shroud, sewing it onto a backing cloth, and sewing patches over the unslightest of damage. These repairs are completed on the 2nd of May covered in cloth of gold. The shroud was then returned to the Savoy's castle.
A 14 feet by 3 feet linen cloth resides in the chapel of the Holy Turin Cathedral.
Un viso e un corpo. It is the single most studied artifact in human history. A cloth. An old linen cloth. That to this day still asks the question whether or not is real.
Ein Gesicht und Körper.
A plethora of questions regarding its authenticity. Is this an evil hoax perpetrated by a clever artist? Or is this cloth a depicted image that would solve all questions? Hundreds and thousands of people believe the face that appears on the linen cloth is Jesus of Nazareth.
And numerous do not.
The cloth itself was once covered in blood, proven to be blood of a crucified man. The question still remains on the identity of the individual and why he was once on a cross. Markings from the body are perfectly aligned as if the body was crucified, leading one to believe that the cloth belongs to Jesus of Nazareth. We interviewed John Jackson to further our understanding of the true identity of the man behind the cloth.
The human blood on the cloth reveals crucial insight on the authenticity of the shroud. Distinct markings reveal the torture the individual must have had gone through. After 3 years of analyzing the data, the Shroud of Turin research project made their findings public at an international conference in New London, Connecticut. All the scientists agreed upon the following statement.
We can conclude for now that the shroud image is that of a real human form of a scourged, crucified man. It is not the product of an artist. The blood stains are composed of hemoglobin and give a positive test for serum albumin.
John Jackson further explains that the crucified man is Jesus of Nazareth because of the nail markings left on the palm of his hand.
For centuries, artistic tradition has shown nails going through the palms of Jesus' hands. The figure on the shroud appears to have been crucified through the wrists. Jackson believes the shroud is the historically accurate version.
You want the person who's crucified to stay up on the cross until they die. There have been experiments performed on cadavers, both with the placement of the nail hypothetically in the palm and in the wrist. And these experiments have shown that the weight-bearing value always settles upon the wrist like you see on the shroud rather than the palm. The palm will just simply tear through.
7 years later, in 1988, the shroud was carbon dated by 3 labs in Oxford, Zurich and Arizona. This testing indicated a date range from between 1260 to 1390, meaning the cloth was to be only about 700 years old. This shook the scientific community, because it meant that all collected data had been incorrect. However, later in 2005, thermal chemist Ray Rogers followed up on new spectroscopic data showing the material of the corner cut for carbon dating may be different from the rest of the shroud. He obtained thread samples from the C14 corner and thread samples from the interior of the shroud. Additional microchemical and spectroscopic tests showed the samples were not the same. Results published in a peer-reviewed journal confirmed initial concerns. The sample cut for C14 dating is from the repair after the fire and not an actual part of the original shroud.
An earthquake in Jerusalem in AD 33 may have caused an atomic reaction which created the Turin shroud and skewed radiocarbon dating results. Scientists believe the Turin shroud may not be a medieval forgery after all. After scientists discovered it could date from the time of Christ. However, a new study claims that an earthquake in Jerusalem in 33 AD may have not only created the image but may also have skewed the dating results. The Italian team believes the powerful magnitude 8.2 earthquake would have been strong enough to release neutron particles from crushed rock. This flood of neutrons may have imprinted an capital X-ray-like image onto the linen burial cloth, say the researchers. In addition, the radiation emissions would have increased the level of carbon-14 isotopes in the shroud, which would make it appear younger. We believe it is possible that neutron emissions by earthquakes could have induced the image formation on the shroud's linen fibers, through thermal neutron capture on nitrogen nuclei, and could also have caused a wrong radiocarbon dating, said Professor Alberto Carpintri, from the Politecnico di Torino. But there are two sides to every argument. What makes people believe that the old linen cloth does not depict Jesus? How can we be sure what side is right?
We do, however, have hard facts on the beliefs of the religions of the world. Christianity, Islam, Judaism, and Hinduism, 4 of the major religions have controversial beliefs toward the Shroud of Turin.
Christianity, a religion that millions follow, believe that the Shroud of Turin is hard evidence in the crucifixion of Jesus Christ. It blatantly supports the Holy Bible in which Christians abide by. Christians do believe that the Shroud of Turin is the only record of Jesus Christ's face. Candida Moss, professor at Notre Dame, goes into further discussion.
For believers, it's much more than a relic. It's evidence of Jesus rising from the dead.
Some people think the Turin Shroud was produced by radiation at the resurrection, in which case that would be material evidence of the resurrection of Jesus. There could be nothing more important than that.
For millions, the shroud is not only proof of the death and resurrection of Jesus, but the only record of what he looked like.
There are no physical descriptions of Jesus in the gospel. None. We don't know what he looked like. We don't know how tall he was. We don't know what the set of his eyes was. But he had a face. He was a real person.
It fulfills almost a temptation to fixate on the face of Christ, to fulfill that idea of the true likeness. What did the Son of God look like?
Furthermore, Muslims do not have any beliefs toward the Shroud of Turin, because of their reasoning that the prophet Jesus did not die on the cross. Because of this worldwide controversy, there are conventions held all over the globe to further the understanding of the Shroud of Turin to people of all religions, including Islam.
To speak to so many different people, and there's such an interest in learning more about the nature of the cloth, about what it's got to teach us.
This forum that we've had here, I think, is the best forum that I've come across for the discussion of the Shroud amongst any community. So I'm really grateful for the community for inviting me, and how wonderful that they managed to get Barry Schwartz, who is the world's leading expert on the Shroud, for 3 days to come and talk about it.
I'm certainly looking forward to coming back and bringing an even larger exhibit of the Shroud of Turin to the people of England, so that the Ahmadiyya Muslim community can get an even more in-depth experience about it.
Judaism relates to Islam in the way that a lot do not believe in the Shroud of Turin. However, it is always possible to look close into the beliefs of others and try to believe it yourself.
Correctly. So, there it is. That's that piece of cloth that got into my life 35 years ago. Well, as a professional photographer, I specialized in scientific, medical, and technical kinds of issues. So I had the skills and the qualifications that were necessary to be a part of the team that examined the Shroud. But when they, when they first asked me to do this, first thing I said was, no. No way. And why did I refuse? Well, the answer is simple. I was very uncomfortable with the subject matter because I was born and raised in an Orthodox Jewish home. Now, I want to be clear about that. I am not a practicing Jew at this point in my life, but I was for that first 13 years. Both my parents immigrated to America from Poland, and when they were little kids, just before World War II. And so my question, and the question that went through my mind at the time, was why would a Jewish man want to get involved with what is probably, arguably, the most important relic of Christianity? At that moment in my life, I couldn't see any benefit to being involved. Well, not only that, I was a total skeptic and figured that the Shroud was probably some form of a painting, which was the conventional wisdom in 1978. I fully expected to get to Turin, take a quick look, see the paint and the brushstrokes, and go home. I even stupidly said that publicly somewhere. And of course, for the last 35 years, I've been living to regret those words. Anyway, in the end, I viewed this whole thing, and this is terrible to admit this close to the Vatican, this was going to be a free trip to Italy. That's what I thought. But, you know, my attitude was immature because I was only 32 years old at the time. My son just turned 33, and I'm still waiting for him to grow up. So, so I can imagine I can't even imagine where my head was in those days. In the end, of course, I did join the team because the image on the Shroud has some fascinating properties that piqued my scientific curiosity. But I still tried to quit twice again. And in fact, as our team grew, a few men from the Jet Propulsion Labs became members of our team. One of them was a man named Don Lind, may rest in peace. Don was an imaging expert from NASA, so he was my hero immediately. And he was the head of imaging on Voyager and Viking and Mariner and Galileo. You might have heard of some of them. So I am pretty sure that any professional photographer given that opportunity would have been honored to be a member of that team. But I remember asking Don at one point during our planning, we planned for 19 months before we came to Turin to examine the Shroud. I remember asking him, I said, Don, what's a nice Jewish boy like me doing on this team? And Don, who was a good Catholic, looked me right in the eye and he said, have you forgotten that the man in question was a Jew? And I said, no, Don, that's probably the only thing I knew about Jesus, that he was a Jew. And then he said, and of course this is where Don, I think God was speaking to me through his lips, he looked at me and he said, oh, so you don't think God would want one of his chosen people on our team? And I laughed. I said, no, Don, I never thought that. And so then Don gave me what perhaps may be the best advice I've ever been given. He said, Barry, go to Turin, do the best job you can do. God doesn't tell us in advance what the plan is, but one day you'll know.
Looming above all other issues is what physicist Paolo di Lazzaro calls the question of questions. How the image was produced, regardless of its age. Every scientific attempt to replicate it in a lab has failed. Its precise hue is highly unusual, and the color's penetration into the fabric is extremely thin, 1/30th the diameter of an individual fiber in a single 200-fiber linen thread. Di Lazzaro and his colleagues at Italy's National Agency for New Technologies, Energy and Sustainable Economic Development conducted 5 years of experiments, using state-of-the-art excimer lasers to train short bursts of ultraviolet light on raw linen, in an effort to simulate the image's coloration. The Energy and Sustainable Economic Development team, which published its findings in 2011, came tantalizingly close to approximating the image's distinctive hue on a few square centimeters of fabric, but they were unable to match all the physical and chemical characteristics of the Shroud image, nor could they reproduce a whole human figure. The ultraviolet light necessary to do so exceeds the maximum power released by all ultraviolet light sources available today, says Di Lazzaro. It would require pulses having durations shorter than 1/40 billionth of a second, and intensities on the order of several billion watts. If the most advanced technologies available in the 21st century could not produce a facsimile of the Shroud image, he reasons, how could it have been executed by a medieval forger? For believers, the radiation thesis suggests that a divine light in the tomb might have seared the crucified form of Jesus Christ onto the Shroud. One could look at hypotheses outside the realm of science, a sort of miracle, says Di Lazzaro. But a miracle cannot be investigated by the scientific method.